So we're continuing with our teachings by these verses of how to kind of work with states of mind that come up all day long, things like anger and jealousy and things like that. All these things are always coming up in our mind, different things. And in the Buddha's teachings, there's ways to work with these things that help us to be much more peaceful and happy and in harmony with other people. And these teachings that I've been kind of going over, these different short verses that are very helpful to my own mind, were written by a great scholar and practitioner, a monk who was born in around 400 AD, I think, and lived in India. So these have been around for a while. And there were about 20-some verses, and we're on about number 16 or so. And this particular verse is one that helps us to get rid of our ignorance. So then what is this ignorance? I think we better start there. In our tradition, we talk about two types. One is what this verse was more talking about, which is a kind of where we don't really understand the nature of reality, how things really exist. We oftentimes see things as if they're like a mirage. You know, when you see a mirage, there's not really water out there, but you're seeing water, right? And so many things that kind of don't quite fall together in our world are like this, where something appears one way, but it actually exists another way. And so sometimes, for instance, we might see somebody thinking they're quite angry with us even, when in actuality, we're just perceiving it that way, and that's not what's going on with them at all. And sometimes later on, when you figure things out with somebody, you see that's the case. So although something appeared one way, it wasn't really existing that way. So all the time with things, we have different levels of ignorance that happen. So the verse by Nagarjuna says, by learning how to cultivate a wholesome dharma, one gets rid of ignorance. And when he's speaking here about a wholesome dharma, he's talking about this wisdom that realizes the nature of reality. Well, that's maybe a little far out for me. So when I think of this verse, in that light, what I try to think of is these verses are all about generosity. That's the whole context of these 20 verses. So the proper way, the full way to say this is by learning how to cultivate a wholesome dharma, one gets rid of ignorance when giving. And so what that would mean in this particular context is the idea that there's a relationship happening between a person who's giving, the gift that's given, and the person who's receiving the gift. None of those exist on their own. If I don't have someone to give something, a person to give something to, giving doesn't happen. These things are interrelated, so they all rely upon each other. There's not an inherently existent solid giver. There's not an inherently existent solid gift. So the whole thing is that's one perspective of how we look at this. And then there's another kind of ignorance that we have, which is more kind of our daily life in terms of our actions. Knowing what's kind of wholesome and what's not so wholesome. What's going to bring us happiness down the line and what's going to lead to suffering. Because one of the main things that the Buddha taught is that when we do things that are kind of virtuous or wholesome, when our motivations are in a good place, the results of that will always be happiness. It might not look that way to us in the moment because we don't oftentimes see when that action that we do ripens. These things can happen way down the line. But this is one of the main teachings of the Buddha. But we have a lot of confusion about what is wholesome a lot of times. And you can just look at your own life to know that sometimes you've done things that you look back years later and you just think, wow, what was I thinking? At the time it seemed like just fine. And later you look back and like, wow, that was really a big mistake. And that's kind of a level of ignorance that we have. So when I use this verse, I actually usually think of that second one, and I think about it in terms of my Dharma practice, and I find this verse to be quite uplifting. It almost goes in line with the verse before it, which was about arrogance. This verse helps me to remember that I'm in the process of learning how to cultivate a wholesome Dharma. I'm I am learning how to practice the Dharma, and that's like a lifelong process. And so as I learn how to cultivate that, and I will have less ignorance. They kind of go back and forth, as I have more wisdom, I'll have less ignorance. As I have more wisdom, I'll know what is a wholesome Dharma. And so that's another more homegrown way to work with this verse as well.